Alright, great. Seems like we're live. Welcome to today's session on the Inspired Yoga Teachers Group. My name is Wenlin. If this is the first time we're meeting, it's a huge pleasure to be here with you. And for today's session, what we'll be doing is we'll be exploring and looking to cultivate a little bit more of interoception. So if you've just joined the group recently and you haven't watched last week's episode, no worries, I'll share the link to last week's episode and that will provide you a little bit of context behind what we're exploring today. And today's session will be an experiential session in which we'll be doing some light movement and I'll be guiding you through some asanas and we'll be looking at some typical alignment cues that you might be hearing from your own 200-hour yoga teacher training or from some other beloved teachers that you might follow in whatever lineage that you've trained in, be it Hatha Yoga, Iyengar Yoga or Ashtanga Yoga. So, and then we'll examine those cues to see if any of them are still relevant to you and your students. So more importantly, we'll be questioning those alignment cues and then exploring and experiencing those cues from inside out, and I'll be providing you a couple of alternatives and options to explore these different movements in various different ways. Alright, so let's begin in a comfortable standing position. If you have any comments, if you're tuning in live, please drop a comment in the comment box. I would love to hear from you. It would be great to say hello, and it would be great just to know that I'm not doing this, of course, alone, just to a video camera. Okay, so alright, let's come into a standing position. And before we do any kind of movement, I want to invite you just to begin to walk around. And as you're walking around, what is happening is you're starting to work in towards your hip flexors, the muscles of your glutes, of course your hamstrings that wrap around the back, some part of the other small muscles, your piriformis, your psoas. These are all working as you're beginning to walk. So as you're walking, just let this be a very comfortable and very easeful kind of walking. You're not too concerned with how you look. Good, a few more breaths just walking on the spot. Feel free to walk off your designated area on the mat as well. Good, and then slowly bring back to a still and come back to your starting position. And once you come back to a starting position, start to look down at your feet and notice what is going on. So one of the main ways to begin to assess your natural gait or stance is to take a gentle, slow walk and then soften and come back to a standing position and just look down to observe your feet. So I can tell you my observations. What I noticed is my right leg here is pointing more forward towards the camera in your direction, but my left leg here is pointing out slightly. So a little bit of what we call external rotation. And it's because I've had an injury on this leg, and in fact I fractured this foot before. So this already reveals something about my natural stance or my natural gait. So what will happen if, let's say, we examine and begin to look at some of the different cues that we might hear. So the first one we'll start with, which everyone is very familiar with, seeing that you are a teacher, is Tadasana or mountain pose. So traditionally in the Ashtanga tradition, or various different Hatha Yoga traditions also, how Tadasana is taught is with feet together. And some traditions even want your big toes to touch, right? And then there might or might not be with a small gap where your heels are. So this depends a lot on your foot anatomy. And let's try this just for a moment, okay? So I want to point out to you that starting to notice as you're standing in this position what is happening. How are you feeling in your legs? And how is this different from before when your legs were apart? So for me, I find that in this position, what I notice is I tend to find it harder to balance. And this is because my pelvis here is wider than where my feet are, and my feet are brought together. Anatomically, this is called adduction, when you move your legs towards each other. So this might be something that already changes the orientation. And let's say you have a student, imagine you have a student who's male, who has hips narrower than yours, and maybe you are female. How might this be different? When they bring their legs together, maybe they feel different from how you are feeling in this pose. So one of the cues that you might hear in a yoga class in Tadasana is to bring your feet together, allow maybe your big toes to touch and let your toes to point forward. That's something I no longer teach, and I have not taught this for a long time simply because I don't feel comfortable or stable in this pose. And what is the most important part of Tadasana is to feel the stability, is to connect with the earth. And we're just beginning with the feet. We haven't even reached the upper body. And what do we know from cueing? Usually when we cue from bottom up. Because if you change something from the top and your bottom is not stable, it's just going to fix some part but not the root of the problem, which is below. Okay, so let's give it a shot and we try. Move your legs apart. And let's try hip distance apart. And let your feet turn to point forward. So I'm going to turn my left leg, which was naturally turned out a little bit forward. And then both feet parallel. And then notice how that feels once again. And also here, if you like, you can lift all your toes. Start to feel how that begins to perhaps cause some sensation, just pulling out of the inner arches of your feet. Maybe you feel that, maybe you don't. And spread your toes. As you spread your toes, maybe you notice the sensation of all the muscles between all your toes. And then slowly and gently land down all your toes, feeling that maybe there's a greater sense of suction. So here in Tadasana, I also want to talk about another point, and we didn't have enough time to talk about this in detail. But one thing you might notice already very important is that there is a huge difference between one person and the other in terms of the base of our feet. I have a very high arch, meaning there's this huge curve between the ball of my feet and my heel. So what is the difference between this, someone who has a more normal arch, so not say normal but average arch, and someone who is flat-footed? So I have a friend who is flat-footed, and basically this friend is exempted from running because it causes just so much pain to all of his joints. So what happens is a flat-footed person is more likely to have the legs and the knees collapse inwards because he or she does not have that arch in the foot to support and spring to keep that rebound and that length through the spine. So your feet are more likely and your knees are more likely, in fact, to knock in. And notice what happens when that's the case. On the other hand, usually, very often, if you have a high arch, what happens is that you're more likely to externally rotate. So your knees might turn out, your femurs are more likely to have this outward rotation in this area. So then what happens is when this is more natural to you, you have to press down more in the opposite direction. So for me, what I find is really important and what I often cue is pressing down, feeling the 4 points underneath your feet and really rooting down through them, under your big toe, your little toe mound, inside corners of your heels, outside corners of your heels, those 4 points. And then depending on what kind of arch you have in your foot, maybe you're flat-footed, maybe you have a high arch like me, maybe you have a more average arch, then I would encourage you to start to explore and feel, do I find it easier? And do I find that, I tend to be, when in a balancing pose, I tend to collapse outwards like this, or I fall inwards like this. So this reveals a lot about your anatomy and how you can find your balance. So we can already tell a lot just from Tadasana here. Okay, so let's continue here with the next pose we'll be examining today, which is tree pose. And I know tree pose is also a very interesting pose because often we teach variations as well in tree pose, right? So usually, how would you cue it? Begin shifting your weight towards one leg, perhaps here if you're mirroring niche towards your left leg. And then I would again cue to press down through the 4 points underneath your feet. Sometimes I would invite my students to soften through the knee, and then as you inhale, feeling the rootedness to begin to spread and lengthen throughout your entire leg. So it's a spiraling and almost this drawing in and upward sensation. So once you feel stable, you lift your other heel off the ground. And then the first option, probably you're familiar, is to begin to rest that against your inner ankle area. The second option would begin to rise it a little bit higher, perhaps on the calf. And then usually the last option would be to raise it all the way towards your thigh area, your inner thigh area. So let's examine all of these options first. What is happening in this pose? So firstly, it's a balanced pose. We are putting most of the weight on one side. So you might feel more of the load on this leg, all the muscles of this leg, of course. The other thing is we have turned your right leg outwards. So this is called external rotation. So you're turning the leg outwards. And what's happening, you stay, I'll show you sideways, is in order to turn this out, there are certain muscles in your legs that help to pull your leg to turn it outwards. These external rotators, which include your glute area, right, help to actually open the leg out, and we're actually working on these muscles in this pose, and that is usually the purpose of this pose. So then what would happen when you do this pose? You want to start to feel the sensations here, right? What's going on in this leg, and also as you're standing through this leg, you should feel the sensations in this leg, and especially on the underside of your foot as well. You're actively pressing through the foot, and you might feel a lot of sensation as you're balancing. So let's give it a shot again, and let's try the other side. Shift the weight on towards your right leg this time. And then starting to notice how you feel the points of contact of your foot with the ground. Is at one point, does it feel more stable and more connected with the earth? What if all 4 points underneath your foot felt extremely stable and extremely magnetized and connected with the earth? Good, and once you feel that, start to transfer more of your body weight towards that foot. Notice the shift. There's this very small shift. Good, and also there's some change in your pelvis as well. And then start to lift your left heel, and then the first option, once again, rest it against your ankle. Notice the sensation. The second option would be then to lift the foot and rest it on the calf. Already notice that this has changed the sensation. Maybe you feel some more sensation in your outer thigh area, your glute area perhaps. And then the last option, usually, what happens is in this option, many people start to yank the foot up really high, and you use the palm to put the foot on the inside of the thigh, and it almost becomes like the goal is to raise the foot really high. Then my question to you would be, what is the purpose of this pose? If the pose is simply just to get an external rotation in your legs, and you're compensating and you're using your arm strength to lift the leg to place it in the inner thigh, is this necessary? Also, what's going on here? Is your pelvis feeling comfortable? Have you yanked up one pelvis very much higher than the other in this pose? Does it feel good to you? If it doesn't feel good to you, then choose what feels good for you. So recently I've also stopped practicing this variation. I don't even demonstrate this variation anymore in the classes because I find it not quite so beneficial, really, this pose. And I've encountered some teachers as well who cue that they allow the knee to move in a tiny bit and then drop the knee down. Imagine the knee is pointing away from you and keeping your hips a little bit more level. So in this way, the external rotation, the turning out of this thigh is not as much as if you just turned it out this way. And you might see my pelvis here. This pelvis is a lot higher, so I'm shortening this side of my waist compared to the other side, if you notice the difference. So then again, I would ask you, what is the purpose of this pose? What are you trying to guide your students to feel here in this pose? Right? If the purpose is to start to cultivate a sense of balance, then any of these options where you're putting more weight on one leg as compared to the other would be enough, would be sufficient. Right? Maybe even this, for example, is also balancing this leg, and you're also strengthening this leg as well. Okay, so this was tree pose. Have a think about that, and also for the upper body variations, I won't be talking about this. Today we'll be focusing more on your lower body. So now that we have an idea of the foundation, we'll look at two more poses, which are Warrior 2 and Warrior 1, because there's so much dispute, so much discussion, let's say, about the cueing for Warrior 2 and Warrior 1. So just now, let's look at the feet again. Let's say we begin with the feet together, right? And then we turn your feet outwards. And then from here, we start to move your legs apart. What happens, this is a heel to heel orientation with your legs. And as you move your legs apart, this is called abduction. So if this is hard to remember, you can remember abducting, which is to abduct. Someone has been abducted, they've been taken away from you. So imagine your legs are being taken away from each other. So this is how I remember it. So this is one of the options, or one of how people cue in the preparation for Warrior 2. And then the next movement will be usually then to bend your front knee and notice the sensation. So what's going on here before we talk about the aesthetic level? So as you begin to move into Warrior 2, this stance, what is the purpose? The purpose is to really start to work with your legs. You're spreading the legs apart, and then you're stretching and lengthening all the muscles here. And what's going on in your front leg? Remember, we did this just now, external rotation, turning out of the leg, turning outwards. And when you turn out and then you engage the leg, what happens? You need your external rotators to work. So again, the glutes, again, the muscles along the side. You might feel your quads here, of course, firing up. So then the question would be, I would like to invite you to start to experiment here. So as you come in towards your Warrior 2, in my classes I no longer say it should be, how many feet distance apart, it should be right under your wrist or whatever, because it is not relevant. At the end of the day, this is also Warrior 2. This is also Warrior 2. But what is the Warrior 2 for you today? And also let's try this. So we had heel to heel orientation, right? So let's give it a shot and try heel to arch. So front heel intersecting the arch of your back foot. Notice how that feels once again. Notice how that changes the sensation in your pelvis. Or maybe if it's not obvious, you can sit a little bit lower and then notice what's going on in my pelvis. So firstly, I want to point out to you that if, for example, you've ever been to a class in which the instructor asks you to move towards the wall and to get your knee and your back thigh as close to the wall as possible, this is anatomically impossible. Because let's take a ruler and notice where your pelvis is. Your pelvis is here. So it's facing this angle actually. Your pelvis cannot be like this. It cannot be like this against the wall. So if it's like this, what happens is you're injuring yourself and you're causing your pelvis to be not level in this orientation. So just allow your pelvis to be, and very naturally in this Warrior 2 orientation, usually your pelvis is not actually flushed against the wall. It will not be. This movement of turning your pelvis to face this side, naturally your knee will turn in a little bit, and also this depends on how wide you can move your legs apart, how far apart you can abduct your legs. So this all goes down to individual anatomy. But already notice this, that in this position, your pelvis is not level, it's not exactly facing the front as much as most people like to imagine. And often a cue that you will hear here in Warrior 2 is to start to bring your chest. So notice if your pelvis is facing this direction, right? So take your fingers and start to palpate the bony parts of your ASIS here, the front. And then imagine you could draw straight lines and let them point ahead. So that's actually the direction of where your body should be. And then, so instead of actually allowing your body to face this direction, we're often cueing our students to turn the torso here. So what's happening? There's actually a twist involved in your upper body in this cue, in most of the way that we are being taught to teach Warrior 2. So again, I would ask you, what is the purpose? What are you trying to guide your students to achieve? If you want to include a little bit of rotation, sure, go ahead. If for you actually you wanted to keep the body in the neutral stance and you want to focus more on the lower half, then allow the body to stay in line with the pelvis so that there's no rotation of your upper body. And also one of the workshops I attended, the yoga teaching even mentioned, so usually we often do this, we tell the students to rotate the body so that they're facing more towards this way. So when you flip the arms up, very nicely the arms come above your legs. Right? What is the purpose of this pose? It doesn't matter whether your arms are right above your legs, even if it looks nice, right? At the end of the day, are you achieving the same if your hips are facing this direction and then your arms come up this way? Do you see the difference? Okay, let's take a break. Slowly and gently begin to straighten your front knee. Let your front foot turn in, let your back foot turn out. We'll explore the same things on the other side. So begin by coming into that stance. So we're in tree pose once again, a starting position, shifting the weight towards one side. Maybe you have heel to heel, we might begin with that. Maybe you have heel to inner arch. And then just try stepping up your foot. Notice how you feel as you bend and you straighten your front knee. Maybe you notice some sensation of the muscles wrapping around the top of your thighs, the sides, the undersides, maybe your right glute here that's working. And then as we come in towards your stance for Warrior 2, I want to invite you to feel that maybe as you're spreading or moving your legs apart, there's some sensation in the underside, right, the opening of your thighs. Another thing I didn't manage to talk about here is if you keep the back foot facing more towards this direction, how your hip is, how wide your hip is will affect how wide you can abduct your legs, of course. But also, for example, for your femur bones, your leg bones, how externally rotated they are will affect how far you can turn your knee back. So my legs tend to be very externally rotated. So I have no problem like letting my knee turn out a lot. But I have students who, for example, the knee is turned out at a 45-degree angle, and that's it. For them, that is their Warrior 2. And it almost even looks like a Warrior 1 stance in the front leg. But does it matter? What is the purpose and the function of the pose? I would invite you to start to think about that and start to explore this with more bodies, not just your own body, but also your student's body. So here, once again, playing around with how wide your feet are, with how far forward your front foot is in comparison to your back foot, and also bending and straightening your knee, starting to notice what contractions and what lengthening sensations you might feel in both your front leg and your back thigh. Good, a few more breaths like this. And then as you're staying here also, just noticing that, as I tell you and share with you this information, what kinds of objections you might be experiencing in your mind. Is there anything holding you back? Are there any beliefs that you have about what a pose should look like, as opposed to what function this pose actually serves? Okay, a few more breaths in your Warrior 2. I'll linger here for a little bit longer, and then you can experiment with the hips as well, with this orientation of so-called squaring the hips versus letting the hips be more neutral, be in a more neutral and natural stance, right? Okay. So once you feel ready and you've explored long enough here in this variation, then we'll look at Warrior 1, the very last stance for today. Okay, so for Warrior 1, usually very often in the Ashtanga tradition, how they teach Warrior 1 is with your feet together, and it's almost like there's a midline, and you'll often see the gurus begin to have their hips very narrow, very extremely narrow. And then what happens is your back foot is turned out, sometimes it's skewed 45 degrees, anything between 40 degrees to 60 degrees. Again, it depends on the flexibility of your ankle, your Achilles tendon, your pelvis and stuff like that. But I want to first point out already, as you step in towards your Warrior 1, very often what you will hear is to get your students to square the hips. So I just want to point out in your Warrior 1 firstly, as you begin to move your legs apart, letting your front knee bend, turning your back foot out slightly at a diagonal, is that it's not, again, let's place your palms on towards your ASIS and notice where the bony parts of your ASIS are. And then here, if your feet are along train tracks and your back heel area is aligned with the inside corners of your front foot, notice how that feels. So for me, this feels very restrictive, and there's not much movement and not much I can do. And in fact, it almost comes back to the same mountain pose that we explored at the beginning with the feet together, because my hips are narrow, my hips are wider than a normal stance, and therefore this feels very uncomfortable for me, and I don't feel stable at all. So instead, if I just chose to widen my feet And now often I cue, allow the feet, the legs to be on two train tracks, or for example, how wide they should be should depend on what feels comfortable and spacious for your pelvis. And then I often get students to just try this movement as you come in towards Warrior Two to move your pelvis and feel that there is space for your pelvis to move and create space. So this will also help with the idea of the squaring of the hips, because again in this stance what happens is your pelvis is not facing the front. It cannot face the front. Only when both feet, if they are in the same direction, if your knees are pointing in the same directions, can your pelvis anatomically be more likely to face in the same direction. So notice your back foot is turned out at an angle, your front foot is turned in the other direction. What happens with your pelvis? Let's move and palpate your pelvis. Let your fingers point forward, and then again, what happens? The direction is this way. It's a little bit closer more towards the front than in your Warrior Two, but still, it is not, you cannot square your hips. When you square your hips, let's just try this for a couple of times. And I'm not a big fan of the cue squaring your hips, because in the recent years, there have been a lot of sacroiliac SI joint injuries that are caused by these cues, these blanket cues that show no understanding of the variation in our skeletal anatomy. So let's try this. So place your fingers on your ASIS and your pelvis. We'll begin to try to square your hips, and then notice what that happens. So it starts to turn your leg inwards and downwards, right? Usually the thing with squaring your hips is, in this orientation, what happens is some teachers are concerned that there's one hip that's hiking up. And indeed, we do see some students doing that. So you can invite your students to level their hips to find a more balanced stance or a more neutral stance. But I wouldn't invite students to rotate their hips completely, just because anatomically that is not honoring your body as it is. So let's try that again. So if you begin to turn and twist and rotate, notice how that feels in your back leg, in your back thigh. Maybe you feel some sensation as well. And then find what feels good for you, and find some sensation as you begin to bend and straighten your front leg. So usually I like to also cue the preparation for the pose to feel what stretch feels good. Right, usually when you abduct your legs apart, the goal is usually to stretch and lengthen the muscles in between. So how far should we go? That's always a question. So I always start with a narrower stance, and then I invite students to bend and straighten, bend and straighten. If you feel you want a little bit more, feel free to step back. And then widen that stance. Find more spaciousness. The last question you might have in your Warrior One, slowly let's change sides, would be whether it's important for your front knee to never move beyond your ankle. Okay, so this is a great question, and there's a lot of debate around this. If you observe martial artists, if you've seen dancers, usually what happens is when they are seen in action, you will see many a times the knees actually move past the ankle. And even if you see images of, for example, Iyengar or Patabi Joyce in various different kinds of yoga poses, so these are the founders of Iyengar yoga and Ashtanga yoga respectively, often you see the knee move past the ankle. So what is the problem with the knee being past the ankle? Actually, I would ask this question. So perhaps if your students have sensitive knees and it is within the interest of you wanting to protect your students, maybe they've had a knee surgery recently and you want them not to over push themselves to cause some kind of tear or some kind of ligament issue here, then yeah, definitely, in general, keep that alignment between the knees and the ankles. But for example, if some students naturally have this knee moving past the ankle and they have no problem with this sensation, and instead when you ask them to inch the foot further, they start to feel this is too much for the widening of the legs. What can you do? You can reduce the stance. You can make this a gentler contraction by bending the knee just a slight bit, and then notice what that happens and how is this different from moving it further away. So these are all options, and I want to invite you to think of poses not as a fixed shape, as a fixed look, but instead as a way to start to move and feel in your body, to explore the different sensations. And the last point I want to mention, Before finishing off today's episode, and there will be time for some Q&A, I will see if anyone has any questions, is many of you might be also intimidated by the idea of exploring or teaching yoga in a way that is more explorative, more from inside out rather than outside in, without using, for example, anatomical terms like quadricep muscles, like abduction, so on and so forth. I want to assure you that if your target students are not yoga teachers, for example, like I'm sharing with you guys, so I know some of you are fans of anatomy, or for example, you're interested in this information. Or for example, if I have a doctor in my class, or if I have some people in my class who are physiotherapists, then usually, yes, I would try to incorporate and mention some of the anatomical terms, but most of your students would not necessarily be interested. So you don't have to feel intimidated if you don't know the name of the muscle that wraps around the top of your thigh or the back of your shoulders, or you don't know what's going on when you bend through the front knee. My best advice to you is to feel it, feel what is going on. Okay, so I'm gonna have a quick look to see if anyone has any questions or comments. If you're tuning in, please let me know. It would be great to hear from you. Oh, hello Taylor. Hi, thanks for tuning in, and Shah as well. I hope today's session is useful for you. And of course, I think the last thing I want to mention, if no one has any questions or comments, please feel free to share them later on as well, is that yes, probably you have some reservations as to how to begin to guide your students with this approach, in which you offer them many options and then they explore. So this would not typically work for maybe say a 60-minute class where you are teaching at a gym and people are expecting a workout. Of course, it has to be in the right setting. But I want to invite you already to start to already push yourself to do this. Even in your own self-practice, start to think about all the cues that you've been so used to, which ones have been making you not so comfortable and why. And also, for example, when you teach your students, whether it's a 60-minute class, a 45-minute class, if it's not possible to cue in a way to cultivate interoception for the full length of class, just do it for 1 or 2 poses. Maybe you workshop Warrior 2 in a specific class, and the goal is to set aside 5 or 10 minutes within the class just to guide your students so that they can start to experience and feel what is going on in their muscles. Because what you're doing is you're slowly educating your students so that they can know how to begin to feel within their bodies. And I know it sounds difficult, but once you start, once your students hit a certain level of self-confidence, a certain level of being able to be guided from within, then this really empowers them, and this really enables them to know how to move safely, to know how to up-level their practice. And it also very importantly keeps them safe, of course, from injury. It also helps you as a teacher to be able to teach them more advanced things as well. So this not just applies to your students, but also to you. Okay. So I'm going to have a quick look to see if anyone has any questions or comments. Okay, Cheryl, thanks so much for tuning in. I'm glad that you enjoyed today's episode. It's great that you tuned in. All right, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to let me know. For the next couple of weeks still in April, we'll be exploring cueing. And I'll be incorporating a little bit of some of what we covered today. I think the next episode will be mostly more lecture style, and I'll be covering some commonly used cues that are taught during maybe your 200-hour, even your 300-hour yoga teacher training, and we'll be breaking it down to see why some of these cues may not be well represented, or maybe there are other ways that you can also cue your students so that you achieve the same effect without, for example, like causing injury or potential risk for harm. All right, so thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. It's been a huge pleasure being here with you. I hope you found it useful, and I hope that it has led you to find more questions. So I think at the end of the day, us as teachers, our goal is not to give definitive answers to our students, because there's no right or wrong in yoga. In yoga, it's about finding your own practice. And us as teachers, we are guides. So how can we guide our students? By providing them a blueprint, like a certain boundary within which they feel safe to explore, to really be free and to be empowered and to feel within themselves. This is the best that we can do. So we have to experiment as well and invite them to be open-minded. So this is what I hope today's session has helped you to begin to move towards this direction. And yeah, I'll be seeing you next week again at the same time, and we'll be talking about some commonly used cues that might lead to some misconceptions with regards to the human body. All right, so take care and yeah, have a great week ahead. Happy Easter to all of you who are celebrating this weekend. Stay safe and well, and see you.